this book is oh, Vivian Ling said it's like a homecoming after 20 years. But Terry, I have to start. I mean, you have such an incredible background, and I won't go through your long resume, CV. But I think one characteristic that some of us may be quite familiar with is your label for so many years as a China hand, and what that means in the broader landscape of U.S.-China relations today. Can you talk a little bit about that sort of label and how it refers to where you are today in terms of reading this book? You were the head of all these organizations that really were connecting U.S.-China relations at the grassroots level. Harvard Yenching, Yale China Association, the Lingnan Foundation, and as the VP of Henry Luce, you're really doing some significant grant work, building relationships. But as a China hand and where we are today, how would you sort of marry that label that you carried, that people placed on you for so long, and how you view your expertise looking at U.S.-China relations today?
Well, Nancy, thank you. It's just a great joy to be with you. We've been such good friends for such a long time, and early on in this process, I had the pleasure of getting your advice. We had some dim sum in Chinatown. And you helped me to think about some of the people who I might write about. But, my being a China hand, someone who follows, who tries to, understand something about China, really goes back to the fact that my father was a U.S. Army officer. And so it was thanks to the Cold War that we ended up in Taiwan. And that's where I got interested in China. And I really didn't get that. I was curious in college. I didn't get that serious about China until I served in Vietnam with the Army myself. And I realized that we as Americans just needed to learn so much more about Asia and about China specifically. The Vietnam War was really a proxy war for the conflict with China, as was the Korean War. And so that's what got me going, and I've just tried to work in different ways to bring more understanding, more appreciation of the complexity and the nuances of this extremely important relationship. And so to get back to your original question, I'm optimistic that this relationship will work out despite the fact that we are facing major problems at the moment.
And besides this group on the call today being part of your fan club, I think many of us have worked for you, either on your nonprofits or also on the boards that you've chaired, managing the U.S.-China or grassroots relationship. But thank you so much for that. And one aspect of what you just mentioned, as far as being on the ground, spending time in Taiwan, being in Southeast Asia during Vietnam War and serving as a proxy, you really had a different vantage point from just the experience you've had on the ground, but also looking at it as a scholar, and then as a nonprofit leader, but then also looking at it as a grant provider. And I'm just thinking about your book and the different individuals you chose to write about. And we'll spend a little bit more time on the Chinese Americans, because that was a question you asked me, was, are there Chinese Americans who might be included in this book? And just for the benefit of those in the audience, when Terry, who was, the board chair when I was at Yale China Association, I felt very unworthy to be providing any sort of input into a book that you might write, just given your great expertise in this area. But also I was so moved that you would consider Americans of Chinese ancestry in this book. And that's something, when we prepared for this conversation, we really wanted to illuminate some of the importance in Chinese Americans and how they have bridged the U.S.-China relationship. And I was wondering, can you share a little bit about the entire slate of characters, individuals? What were the standout qualities in terms of narrowing down this group to the 10 individuals that you wrote about?
Right. Well, there are 10 chapters, but there are actually 13 different people. But Nancy, I felt it was absolutely essential to include the stories of some Chinese Americans. Uh, their story has not been adequately recognized. The role that they have played in fostering relations between the United States and China has not been adequately understood for reasons that we could discuss and we should discuss. But each of these characters, and I started with pre-normalization of diplomatic relations to show that there were Americans who were getting into China. Not many, because China was off limit to American citizens until 1971. But I felt that we needed to understand this earlier period of the Cold War. And then I focused on the post-normalization period of which is now called engagement. And I think we are still very much engaged with China. I think those who say engagement is over are just wrong. And Stape Roy, who's on this call, played an absolutely critical role in making normalization of diplomatic relations possible. When I started interviewing Stapleton Roy, who was very, very kind, very generous in speaking with me, I thought maybe he would say, I said, what was the most important thing you did in your diplomatic career as a U.S. Foreign Service officer? And I thought maybe he would say, well, of course, it was ambassador to China in the early 1990s. But no, he said it was working with Leonard Woodcock as who was the head of the U.S. liaison office in Beijing, and Stape Roy was his number two. And the two of them negotiated the final terms of the agreement with Deng Xiaoping. The sticking point for the whole thing was Taiwan. And to this day, the issue of Taiwan, and particularly arms sales to Taiwan, has never been fully resolved. And Stape Roy and others, the Americans and the Chinese, both sides knew that it was unresolved, but they agreed to move ahead with it. So each of these chapters identifies a different theme, a different period, a different, I think, important topic. And what struck me in the course of writing the book is that so many of these themes continue to be extremely relevant to this day, including Taiwan, human rights, freedom of the press, academic freedom, and so on and so forth.
I love how you split up the book into the two sections. So the first one being from Cold War to reconciliation, and the second part from cooperation to competition or engagement overall on a broader topic. And you talk about three Chinese Americans, and for the audience today, we will really try to break that down a little bit, just given the current climate around Chinese Americans, anti-AAPI, the former administration, considering and creating a target among Chinese Americans and AAPIs around the reference to the Chinese flu and the Kung flu, but also how little we've moved in the understanding of transnationals, Chinese Americans, their role in U.S.-China relations, even though there are these organizations like C100 and others who have really tried to forge those ties. And we'll talk about Shirley Young a bit, and Shirley's one of the co-founders of C100s, and also the constant role that these individuals have played in that relationship. I think the objectivity that they held in their relative roles, whether it's in science, in corporate, or in journalism, the very interesting way they married their personal journeys with their professional careers. So would love to, go right into, we have some images to bring people sort of quickly up to speed on the three individuals that we'll talk about, and fully acknowledging that Ambassador Roy is on the call. And Terry, you need to give us a whole list of all the other speaking engagements, because you have 13 individuals and we want to hear about each one of them. So thank you for those of you who are calling in and focusing with us a little bit more on the Chinese Americans in this journey. So we can pull up the PowerPoint, and maybe Terry, you can share a little bit about our first individual, Chen Young. And you started off his chapter with the unbelievable interaction between Chen Young and Mao Zedong. So tell us why you picked Yang Zening.
Well, the whole issue of scientific exchange was absolutely central to the PRC's modernization efforts. And they saw Yang, and here we have him on the right of this slide with T.D. Lee, Tsung-Da Lee. And this is when they are at the Princeton the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. And they've just received news of winning the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1957. Both Yang and Lee grew up in China. They came to study at the University of Chicago. And this Nobel Prize in 57 just catapulted them to international fame. And so in the next slide, we see Yang with his family of 3 children and his wife, Shirley Young. His wife, interestingly, her father was a nationalist Chinese general, and he was imprisoned in the PRC for 10 years. And so this speaks to the way in which so many of these Chinese Americans in these earlier years had extremely complicated personal relationships because of their family and relatives still in China or in Taiwan or Hong Kong. And then we come to the next slide, where indeed Yang is meeting with Mao Zedong. After the travel ban, the US travel ban was lifted on going to China in 1971, Yang visited. He met with Zhou Enlai in 71 and with Mao Zedong, as you mentioned, Nancy, in 73. And what he saw in China impressed him so much. He saw so much progress that he became an outspoken advocate for establishing diplomatic relations between the US and China. And this was something that in writing about him, it made me extremely interested. It made me want to write about him, but it was totally unexpected that he would actually become a theoretical physicist, would become a political advocate. And then in the last slide for Young, here he is celebrating his 90th anniversary. This is after his wife died several years earlier. And he remarried, married a much, much younger Chinese woman. And they're celebrating his 90th anniversary in Hong Kong. He will be 100 years old in September of this year. But he's now living at Tsinghua University in Beijing.
I love this story that, and this is his younger wife, I believe. Is that right?
Yes. Oh, yes.
At his, I think at his 90th birthday. What's fascinating also about Yang Zening is his 100-year span really does span simultaneously the volatility in the relationship with China, their relationship at post-Civil War. And also, wasn't he also a recipient and beneficiary of the Boxer Indemnity Scholarship Program?
Yes, I think that's right. Yes.
So he touches in all these areas. And go ahead.
Well, and I think he felt obligated to do something for China and to help build up Chinese science, especially in physics, of course. But I think he also felt a certain measure of guilt because many of his friends, many of his good friends and colleagues who had studied in the university decided to go back to China in the early 1950s after the founding of the People's Republic. He decided to stay in the US where he thought he would have more opportunity, but he was always torn about this decision. And he did not become a US citizen until 1964. And when he and T.D. Lee went to Oslo to accept the Nobel Prize, he had a permanent residency in the U.S., but he actually had a passport from the Republic of China, Taiwan. And so, again, it speaks to the complexity of, and the difficulty of how Chinese Americans of this generation had to present themselves and explain themselves and figure out what their, or at least for other people to figure out what their identity was.
I love the different reference points you have in the chapter on Dr. Young, and when you talk about his abiding sense of obligation to his family in China, especially to his father, that Confucian sort of filial piety. But at the same time, further in the chapter, you talk about how, China treated him not as a traitor when he went back, but as a prodigal son.
Yes.
And I just, could you illuminate a little bit more even about expanding on the idea of his identity and his like the cravings of the heart, and something we talk about at MOCA a lot, the Chineseness that doesn't seem to leave, and is constantly embodied in especially people of his generation and their ties and pulls. Is it the lack of acceptance in America, even though he seemed to have a very rewarding and happy life, as you refer to it, or is it just that Confucian pull to China as a geography, not necessarily as a political regime, because obviously the regimes had changed?
Yeah, I think he, like many, immigrants to the United States, he felt allegiance to both countries. But for Young, particularly, given the fact that he was in his early 20s when he came to the U.S., he felt this deep connection to his own culture. I write in the chapter about the fact that his father, his father was a well-known mathematician who had also studied in the United States at Stanford and Chicago in the 1920s. His father had encountered overt racism. Young, encountered much less of that. But his father, rather than teaching him mathematics, taught him the Chinese classics. Taught him to recite Chinese poems, taught him about Chinese culture and tradition. So it was in his blood, and I think he just never forgot that. And the fact that his parents, and particularly his father and then his brothers and sisters, had stayed in China, made him feel that he had this responsibility for giving back to China. And one of the most striking things that I learned about him was his saying in an interview that he gave in Hong Kong in later years, that the most significant thing that he'd done in his life was not winning the Nobel Prize, but being able to do something to connect China to the rest of the world, to improve science and education in China, to help make it modern, to advance China. And so he was a patriot. So the gravitational pull, and I think you put it very, very well, Nancy, the kind of the gravitational pull of not the Chinese system of government necessarily, but China as a culture, especially if you grow up in that culture, was something that was something that he could not resist.
I was just thinking the word, it's a Chinese culture, because when you really think about his time in China, it wasn't as if it was an American who grew up in a suburb of, New Jersey and remembers his backyard and the big oak tree or whatever it might be, and remembers going to the corner store. He lived in a multitude of places in China, whether he was in Hefei or Beijing or Kunming or Hong Kong, and he was all over China. So it wasn't this association to place, but that culture, which was so heavily laden in his heart.
Yes, and not only that, Nancy, but the China that he knew, the China he grew up in, especially during his teenage years, was a China at war with Japan. It was a China that was poor and being devastated, and it was a China in ruins. And so I think he felt a compulsion, as I say, a responsibility to try to recover China. And he realized full well that that had two sides to his identity. One was, to the West, which had really given him the opportunity to be a great scientist, but the other was to his homeland, his motherland.
It's fascinating.
I should add, which had given him essential values, including the value of loyalty to not only to culture, but to his own family. And his father also was a Chinese patriot. Yeah.
It's incredible. And we look forward to celebrating his 100th birthday in September. We could spend a lot more time on Dr. Young, and I think maybe we'll leave it for the questions. I'm sure there'll be questions about scientists, Chinese ancestry, spies, and all that type of, that thematic component. But let us move to Shirley Young, who, for some reason, every time Shirley passed away a couple of years ago during the middle part of the first part of the pandemic, and we sent our regards to her family. But I always mistakenly would call her Ambassador Young. She just seemed so ambassadorial to me, and she'd always use me to correct me. Nancy, I've never been an ambassador, but she just seemed so diplomatic and so such a peacemaker. And she was, importantly, also one of the co-founders of C100. And also grew up in a very tumultuous China-U.S. back and forth connections. And tell us why Shirley Young, if for this audience benefit.
Well, I especially wanted to write about business in China. But at the same time, I wanted to write and it's not only her chapter, but it shows up elsewhere. I wanted to write about the importance of cultural exchange. And so Shirley, filled the bill in both ways. And as you say, Nancy, she had an extremely complicated personal early history, which was true for, many Chinese Americans. She wanted to be an ambassador. So you're exactly right. She thought of herself as a cultural ambassador because she never was able to become a diplomatic ambassador like Stape Roy. But here we have a photo of her on the left at the age of about 10 with her older sister Jean and her younger sister Frances and her mother Juliana. And this must have been not too long after they came to the U.S. at the end of World War II. Shirley was born in Shanghai, but then grew up in Europe, but spent these early years in the Philippines. And tragically, her father, who was a diplomat with the nationalist government, was executed by the Japanese during the war. So Shirley, if we could have the next slide, went to Wellesley College, became a businesswoman, and she actually encountered more discrimination as a woman than she did as an Asian, which I thought was an interesting comment on her part. But she played a critical role in helping General Motors, GM, to enter the China market during the 1990s. And there were many skeptics about whether GM could actually sell cars in China, but it ended up being a huge success. And then, if we could see the next slide, as you've mentioned, after Tiananmen in 1989, Shirley Young and 5 other prominent Chinese Americans established the Committee of 100. And here from left to right, we have Henry Tang, C.S. Wu, Chen Chong Wu, who actually was a researcher at Columbia who did a lot of work with Shirley Young and T.D. Lee on the research that led to their Nobel Prize. Yo-Yo Ma, Shirley, who was the first chair of the Committee of 100, Oscar Tang, and of course, I.M. Pei.
And of course, everyone looks exactly the same as they do today.
They all look great.
They all look
great. Yeah.
And this was 1990, I believe. Right?
This was around 1989, 90. Yeah, yeah. And we could talk more about the committee if people want.
Yeah, definitely. And just, it's interesting because it seems as if from your chapter that she really did focus less on her Chinese heritage. I wasn't sure if it was because of her selection of, profession in terms of going into a even more male-dominated sector and sort of dealing with what you say was the discrimination as a woman over someone of Chinese ancestry. But it seems as if she assimilated quite quickly. I'm wondering, can you tell us a little bit about the trajectory of her embracing her Chineseness? And how she sort of shared a little bit on that front, and what was the catalyst for her to join this group to form the Committee of 100? Was there a moment for her?
Right. Well, I think she did. She says that she was, or she told me, and she's told others, that she was not that interested in her own Chinese heritage when she was growing up. At Wellesley College, there were a few Chinese women, but being Chinese was not really a distinguishing factor. So she didn't study Chinese language. She didn't major in Chinese history or whatever. And but on the other hand, it was obvious that China was part of who she was. And her mother in particular, of course, who had grown up in Shanghai and, was deeply Chinese, much like Shirley Young, instilled in her, I think, a real understanding of what it meant to be Chinese. They spent some summers in Hong Kong, but it was not until 1979 that she visited China. And I think, as you suggest, Nancy, because she was on a business track, she was not that much interested or aware of China. China was not a big business opportunity yet. And it was almost by accident, because she was Chinese. She had a business background in advertising. She was not a GM engineer, and she was not a China hand or a China specialist. And so it was almost by accident that, because of the advertising that GM really needed in the late 1980s when they were floundering, that she came to General Motors, and the chairman, Jack Smith, said, "Hey, you're Chinese. You must know something about China." Well, Shirley very modestly took the job, but she went to the Chinese engineers working in Detroit and said, "Hey, tell me what I need to do. Tell me what I need to know." Then, many of those engineers had come from China more recently, and so they understood the system. They understood how deals were negotiated. And so, of course, when she did end up spending more time in China, living in China, she learned and became much more proficient with the language, and really did learn the Chinese culture, and it became central to her work. If we could have the next slide. with the U.S.-China Cultural Institute, which she founded after retiring from GM in the early 2000s. And this was, it is, I should say, an institute because it's still operating to foster exchanges in music and the performing arts between the United States and China. And so this is when Shirley really embraces her Chinese American identity.
And just connecting back to Dr. Young, now we have two individuals who have quite, immediate connections, whether familial or through marriage, to a very elite group of individuals in China. So we're dealing with post-Civil War, 1949, and there's this exodus. When you were writing these two chapters, did you think a little bit about the density of individuals like Shirley Young and Dr. Young in terms of their presence in America? There was obviously, before 65, there was a quota of 105, and usually skilled laborers that came. And there is that collection of data that many of them were from quite well-off Shanghainese families. And then we have that contrast with those who had come in the part of the 19th century that were more of the laborers who helped build the infrastructure of America through the Transcontinental Railroad. But you're now in a very tight circle of individuals. And I think some of us recognize that Oscar Tang was also married to Shirley Young's sister. So it's, again, a very tight, a group of individuals, a lot with the Shanghai connection and a lot with, the Guomindang connection. Can you break that open for us a little bit, just so, that density isn't necessarily something to take for granted? Was it the true Guanxi network at play?
Oh yeah, I think that's certainly a part of it. These were families that were well off in Shanghai by and large. They had the ability to go to the United States for education, or they left for other reasons. So they had the resources. But just to emphasize one of the points you make, many of them, all of them really, or not all, but certainly a very significant number in this group came as students. Shirley came earlier and then became a student, but it was really for education. And here the thing to remember is the fact that students and diplomats and business owners who were Chinese were they were exempted from the exclusion acts. They were not large in number. There were many more laborers and others, who were not allowed to enter, men and women, but students were allowed. So this is an alternative narrative that's very important, very significant to the evolution of U.S.-China relations and Chinese-American relations. And so a lot of them end up in New York. I think it's because, Shanghai and New York have a lot in common as commercial centers, and they become very successful. And because it's a relatively small group, they do know each other. But I focused on them because their role, they have the ability to play this significant role in the exchange process.
It's so interesting. And let's segue to Melinda Liu, who also sort of a product, and the family exits also around the Civil War. And you also see a similar movement where they have, gone to, moved within domestic China because of the war. And there's a connection, and then they move out. And she was really Melinda Liu was a pioneer in the journalistic field, and takes all these incredible roles, really leveraging some of her cultural know-how, even though she's an ABC. So she's the one of the three American-born Chinese. She grows up in, I think, Minneapolis, has a sort of Midwest Ohio upbringing. And then she ends up becoming both the head of starting the Newsweek Beijing bureau, but also working for the wonderful magazine Far Eastern Economic Review. For those who really did that scholarship work in the 80s and 90s, was the go-to magazine on what was happening in the region.
Right.
Why Melinda Liu? What does she represent in this conversation?
Well, again, I wanted to include the theme of the media and journalism, because that's the way most of us learn about the world, and I thought it was important to include that as a topic. And then, as I began to learn about Melinda Liu's background, which you've already described very well, Nancy, I thought she was just a wonderful character to include in the book, and she was very gracious in speaking with me. She, like Shirley Young, earlier in her life, growing up in Ohio, had relatively little interest in anything Chinese, but she was Chinese, and it wasn't until she went to Taiwan after college on a fellowship to study Chinese opera, which was a passion of her father's, that she had to get serious about Chinese language. And she became a journalist to make ends meet, to make some money. And so, as you say, she opened up the Newsweek bureau in Beijing in 1980 after normalization. It was the first time that American journalists had been allowed in China for anything more than a 2-week visit with Nixon or ping pong. So this was a real turning point. And like you also mentioned, her parents had been in China during the Second World War, and they were part of this group that became the Chinese diaspora. And so in the next slide, to me, this is a deeply moving and deeply personal part of the story. This is Melinda on the right with her eldest brother in Suzhou. She had never met her brother until she visited in 1979. And the older brother had stayed behind in China with his grandmother when the parents went to study in Minnesota. And they expected, this was very soon after the end of World War II, 1945 or 46, they expected that they would return from the United States after a year or two. Because of the Civil War and then the Revolution, they did not return. And so it took this long for Melinda to meet this older brother. So again, to me, this speaks to the complexity of these relationships. Over the years, and the next slide, Melinda covered China's opening to the West in the 80s, and major events like June 4th, and here we see her in Tiananmen Square after June 4th with two colleagues in 1989. She covered the 2008 Summer Olympics. And next slide. And this is a more recent photo of Melinda, who is one of the most experienced American correspondents who have covered China over the years. Most journalists, when they go to a foreign country, stay for only 2 or 3 years. Melinda has been there on and off for decades. And in fact, she still lives and writes from Beijing. And we have one. Do you want to talk about Melinda before we go to the next?
I'm so marveled by this quote from 251. You just said from Melinda, and she writes this in 2006. And as a reminder to our audience, she writes, after decades of isolation, after 25 years of trying to catch up with everyone else, Chinese are finally beginning to see themselves quite comfortably now, drinking Starbucks coffee, eating McDonald's. And then you sort of summarize that internationalization and economic prosperity, it seemed to Liu and many others, would lead naturally to a more liberal society. And I wonder, I know so much has happened since actually even this book has gone to print, with the US-China relationship. And I wonder, just given her journalistic expertise and how much you were thinking about that bilateral relationship from the lens of the media, wondering if you wanted to share a couple of thoughts right now about where we are today and how we got here so quickly from what was not too long ago an optimistic bilateral relationship.
I think the relationship, as I hope the book, shows, has always been complicated. The mistake we make, I think, is that, particularly in the media, we tend, and others have mentioned this, we tend to see China only through one lens at a time. And so right now, it's the lens of authoritarianism. China is, and there's good reasons for this. The abuses to human rights, the limits on freedom of the press, and so forth. But I think we need to remind ourselves that there are many more perspectives on China. So I use the metaphor of the blind man and the elephant. It depends what part of the beast you're touching, what part of the reality. And so many of the issues that we're confronted with today are not new. They're unresolved. Human rights, transfer of intellectual property, Taiwan, academic freedom of the press, as I mentioned before. But I think the bottom line for me is that human relations really do matter, and they exist within this framework of state-to-state relations. But if we only see it through the prism of talks between Biden and Xi Jinping, we're missing so much. And so I guess I would just conclude by saying the change is inevitable. It's a two-way process. Americans cannot change China, but China will change, and the relationship has changed, and it will continue to change. And so I'm basically optimistic.
I love how you present that, and also highlighting the fact that not only do we not have people-to-people exchanges very much now, and Chinese international students have reduced, and there's just as not the 100,000 strong initiative to try to get US students to go to China and learn Chinese. Obviously, that was a big initiative under Obama, and none of these programs are happening right now. And at the same time, Biden and Xi they're probably not Zooming. They're going through some other medium, but they're not even seeing each other face to face, which I think is so detrimental. We have a number of questions here, and I think maybe segueing to one of them in particular, coming from Jeff Tao, is, Presidents Obama and Biden have not had China experts who advise very much on Chinese culture and politics. I think this is a great question, and it kind of goes into some of the role of Chinese Americans. Why is that? Why, is that not a disadvantage considering the importance of the bilateral relationship? And we've talked a lot about subjectivity versus objectivity in terms of the relationship and contributions by those who might be of Chinese ancestry. What can the administration do more of in terms of engagement on cultural and politics?
Mm-hmm. Well, there have been U.S. administrations that have had, China scholars as advisors. Mike Oxenberg and Ken Lieberthal and Evan Medeiros and many others. But I think the question here for me is, why has the role of Chinese Americans been overlooked? And why aren't there more people like Gary Locke, right, who you'll be honoring at your upcoming dinner? And I think there are various reasons we can point to. One is the history of racism in the United States. which includes the Red Scare of the early 50s, which Shirley Young experienced, but also the more recent anti-Chinese racism. And so the lesson from this, for a lot of people would be, don't stick your head out. Keep a low profile. Don't run for political office. Don't get involved in politics. It's too dangerous. But beyond that, it's even more complicated because on the Chinese side, because of the fact that these Chinese had lived in the United States, which was the imperialist enemy for so long, their loyalty was questioned from the Chinese side. Many of these same Chinese Americans, as we've already mentioned, had relatives in China. They had to worry about, especially during the Maoist years, they had to be concerned about what they could say in public, right? You don't want to endanger your relatives. And then on top of everything else, there were divisions within the Chinese American community over their loyalty to Taiwan or to the PRC, the mainland China. So I think all of these things have made it more difficult.
And what's interesting, I like the way you present, these aren't new tensions, these are unresolved. And yet they've been unresolved for 2.5 generations. Mm. And that's on specifically issues around like Taiwan, where, we talk a lot about identity politics, but now we've gone into nearly 3 generations of Taiwanese getting taught in schools on Taiwan and much more of a clinging to Taiwanese identity and Taiwanese American identity. So much so that the Museum of Chinese in America really struggles with that tension in terms of representation of a very important group post-65, post-49, and for those who came from Taiwan, whether directly as Taiwanese or, after the Civil War in 49. And I just think that that's one group that you did not pick a representation of. And another question that came up that's related is, it must have been really difficult for you to narrow down the list of 13 people. And were there any Americans you had hoped to include in your book, but left out? And perhaps maybe the top 2, 3 that you left out, but you said, ooh, that would have been a good chapter. And I didn't include them for whatever reason.
Yeah, it was a very difficult process. And there were many, many more people who should be written about, who deserve to be written about. And I just had to, there were only so many that I could write about. And I considered some people, like I.M. Pei, for example, but decided in the end that a lot has already been written about him. I mean, he's an extremely well-known figure, and deservedly so. And so I thought that it would be important to write about, and other people would ask me, oh, are you going to write about Henry Kissinger? And I thought, no, Henry Kissinger has written his own books. A lot of books have been written about Henry Kissinger, so that we don't need, that story has been told. So I decided to write about some people who are, in many cases, a little bit below the radar. And I won't spend time, mentioning all the other people who might be considered. But the other big issue for me was whether these people had actually spent a lot of time living and working in China. And so there are a lot of other people who have done work on China, but who have not spent that much time there.
Right.
And I wish I could have included more on Taiwan, but this is really focused on the PRC.
So tricky. It's so very tricky, but this book is such a helpful lens into, I guess, for lack of a better, real people who are on the ground, really trying to make a difference. And also the chapters on Ambassador Roy, Jerry and Joan Cohen, Elizabeth Perry, so interesting from the lens that you shared. And it's as if you had them in your mind in conversation at all times. I just love the way you've written the book. And I guess other people who have definitely been mentioned are Hank Greenberg, obviously well-known China hand, and AIG being found on the romantic bund in 1919. And also just another question, relating to others, but also thank you for mentioning this, Jeff. Jeff Tao mentions that polls show that 66% of Americans dislike China. I don't know which poll that is, Jeff, but that's really disappointing, that number. Whether it's the government or the people, there's just a general dislike. And I'm sure the current day Olympics, and Melinda Liu talks about the 2008 Olympics. And I don't know if you want to weave in a little bit of your, the patriotism question that's coming up of people of Chinese ancestry. But what can Chinese Americans and Chinese residing in America do to turn around or contribute to better people-to-people relations from their role here in the U.S. now? Yeah,
well, I would say all of us need to keep engaging with China in different ways. Fortunately, the Fulbright program, I hope, will be reinstated by the Biden administration. Peace Corps, it would be wonderful if they could return. I doubt that will happen. But the arts, performing arts, and cultural programs are still going on, although they're facing a hiatus because of the pandemic. But I hope that they will continue. But I think that these human relationships need to continue, and that's the best way to counter these kind of knee-jerk responses to questions of, do you like or dislike China? Our images and perceptions of China have always been superficial. Generally, they swing with the news cycles. And so I don't put a lot of stock in these numbers. These numbers can flip, they can change very quickly, very easily. Now we're in a period, and we don't know how long it will last, where U.S.-China relations are at a very low point. But inevitably, they will change. And so we just need to keep doing what we're doing in terms of education and exchange and understanding. And Nancy, we're so much further ahead than we were 2-3 generations ago, when we had so little access to China. Again, we're in this very difficult period where we can't get to China. It's more difficult for Chinese to get here. On the Olympics, the press coverage of Eileen Gu, to me, has been a bit disturbing, it's worrisome, because there's all kinds of, bicultural and binational athletes in different sports all around the world, but she has received undue attention, and she's in a difficult position because the PRC does not allow dual nationality, and so she's avoided the question of whether she's given up her U.S. citizenship. But she's also been criticized for having a lot of corporate sponsorships. There was even a Fox News commentary that said Eileen Gu has turned her back on the United States. She has betrayed America. And I think that is just one step away from anti-Chinese, anti-Asian racism. I think that's very dangerous.
And the Olympics.
I think we need to be more cosmopolitan. We need to be more. We need to realize this is a globalized world, and that athletes can, if they have one parent who happens to be Chinese and the other happens to be a white American, it's their choice as to who they want to ski for. And Eileen Gu happens to be extraordinarily fluent in Chinese, and she even has the Beijing accent, right? I don't know if you listen to her online, but she's great.
That's one thing. It's a lot easier to learn Chinese Mandarin these days, and I think with all the access points and technology than ever before. I have the best compliment came in through the Q&A, and it is from the revered Professor Deborah Davis. Thank you, Debbie. She writes that this is the best dialogue with an author I've seen in the last 2 years of Zoom. So I think you can't get a better compliment than that, Terry.
Well, it's only thanks to you, Nancy. It's thanks to your great questions and the fact that you read the book so carefully.
Oh, the book is fabulous. And I really encourage everyone. This is just the vantage point that Terry has, and also his, I guess, your big heart for building relationships just one-on-one through your entire career. And it's whether it's really listening hard in conversations and understanding people's sentiments and asking the questions. Terry, thank you so much for everything that you've done and all the different avenues and the places. And I feel extremely blessed that even as a very sort of, I guess, hot-tempered 30-plus-year-old, working at Yale China, you were so gentle and kind with me. Oh. And I've learned so much, and I hope I've been a little bit more professional.
Not at all. No, Nancy, if I could just say how very much I admire and appreciate the work that you do at MOCA, at Yale China, and elsewhere to combat anti-Chinese racism and to encourage more understanding of the critical role that Chinese Americans have played to improve this relationship in so many different ways. So the work that you're doing at MOCA is just essential, and I just applaud you. I salute you for that.
And it does. It takes a, or maybe I'll say it takes a Toisan village, even though I'm not Toisanese. But it takes the MOCA team that works very hard. And we say that there's most museums are considered passive organizations, but as those Mandarin, we always say there's a MOCA sudu, that there's a pace that we need to keep up with to make sure that we can help this relationship. But it would be remiss for us to say, Terry, you've dedicated this book to someone we both admired so much, to Doug Murray, and you say as a friend, mentor, and advocate for understanding between the U.S. and China. And we wanted to dedicate this time together to Doug Murray as well, and just to remember him in all that he did, all the smiles, all the conversations, and thank you so much for writing this book, and also for mentioning Doug as just that representative for whom you dedicated the book.
Sure.
Yeah, and thanks to everyone on the call. There are so many more questions, but thank you please buy the book. Tim and Ping say thank you. Terry, your wonderful conversation from Mamie Lee, and you, the list goes on. We'll send you a whole collection of those wonderful accolades. Most importantly, buy the book, Americans in China, Encounters with the People's Republic. And you need to write Americans in Taiwan, help the relationship. Nice. And we have a slew of other programming. Happy Lunar New Year, Year of the Water Tiger. Continue staying with us. We have storytelling, wonderful programs for children. We are honoring Governor Gary Locke, Ambassador Secretary, whichever honorific you want to use, Dr. David Lamb, and the World War II veterans who were recently recognized, and also the Joy String Ensemble. So happy to welcome all of you back. But most of all, Terry, thank you for writing the book, and thank you for spending time with us. Yeah.
You bet.
Have a good night, everyone. 新年快乐，恭喜发财。
Okay.